Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Spoiler alert, this edition of the program is not about the Trump impeachment drama. Instead, we focus on Ukraine. And why are the corporate media so misleading about the military coup in Bolivia? Cross-talking some real news. I'm joined by my guest, Glenn Deason. He is a professor at the Higher School of Economics, as well as author of The Decay of Western Civilization and Resurgence of Russia. We also have Dmitry Babich. He is a political analyst and editor at InnosMe Internet Media Project. And in London, we cross to Marcus Papadopoulos. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. I'm going to go to, as usual, to Marcus in London first here. I hope you didn't waste too much time watching the congressional hearings over the last week. It was a total waste of time. It was a kangaroo court. But one thing that kind of struck me is that and I didn't know this, I didn't know that the United States and Ukraine were the kind of strategic allies that they were made out to be on national television. So tell me, Marcus, when did this happen? Because as far as I know, Ukraine is not in NATO. The United States and Ukraine have no treaty of self-defense protecting each other. None of these things exist. They've never been debated. But apparently, according to these functionaries that spoke to Adam Schiff, Ukraine is an important strategic ally. Your thoughts, my friend?
Well, Peter, allow me first of all to say this. There is a clear attempt by the liberal elite within the American establishment to subvert American democracy. And this latest attempt to impeach Donald Trump really does epitomize what is going on in America. Now, turning to Ukraine, Peter, during Mikhail Gorbachev's tenure in the Kremlin, he once remarked that there can be no Soviet Union without the Ukraine. And indeed, that accurate statement by Gorbachev can be equally applied to the Russian Empire. Namely, without the Ukraine, there could not have been a Tsarist empire. For centuries, the Ukraine has been of absolute importance to Moscow, both in Tsarist and communist times and in present-day times. However, Peter, the Ukraine is also of enormous importance to America, because not only does Washington covet the industrial and agricultural sectors of Ukraine, along with its Black Sea coastline, but American policymakers understand that by depriving Russia of a close relationship with Ukraine, this will weaken Russia in Europe and thereby weaken Russia in the world. In short, Peter, without Ukraine, without a close relationship between Russia and the Ukraine, the Americans know that Russia will never have the kind of power it wielded in Soviet times. That is why the Americans now have a foothold in Ukraine, and they're not prepared to relinquish that. Even if that means pouring in hundreds of millions of dollars each year, the Americans know the sheer importance of it. And look at NATO, Peter. Not only are they establishing a naval presence at Odessa, but they are also establishing a naval presence at another very important Ukrainian port, which was established in Soviet times, Oshakov. Now, that just demonstrates why Ukraine is of so much importance to America.
Okay.
But also, look at the map of Europe, and you will see that if Ukraine ever joins NATO, then Russia will be completely encircled on its western borders. Ukraine is the missing piece in the jigsaw at the moment for America and NATO.
Okay, well, Glenn, you know, at the same time, and if you going back to these hearings here, you got the impression that it's the United States that has to prove its bona fides, that it is a good ally of Ukraine. It's all upside down, okay? Because we all know, or anyone that knows something about Ukraine knows that it's really intensely corrupt, number one. And number two, the people of Ukraine haven't been asked about this here, okay? I mean, it seems everything is upside down. It's the national security state that needs Ukraine for two reasons: to maintain a rationale for its existence and to pointlessly antagonize Russia. It has almost nothing to do with Ukraine, in a sense.
No, I agree. And, well, at first it seemed at face value simply to be reflecting domestic issues. So obviously, if you can present Ukraine as a critical ally, that suggests that Trump's neglect of Ukraine, or, the so-called bullying or against Ukraine was merely almost a sort of treason, so throwing away a critical or strategic ally in order to get an upper hand on the Bidens. Now, I do think it represents also has a strong international dimension, obviously. So already obviously in 2008, when NATO had its Bucharest summit, right, this was the main, well, the Americans were pushing very hard to get Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, but the Europeans resisted, knowing that yes, this would be a strategic advantage or an expansion towards Russia, which
could be a strategic blunder at the same time.
Well, the consequences would have to be bared by the Europeans, because this would obviously create huge conflicts with Russia. So I do think that this effort to change the language and essentially begin to bring Ukraine gradually in, it does reflect something much deeper than merely this campaign against Trump.
But what's really interesting here, Dima, is that if you kind of step back and you look at what's going on under the new President Zelensky, he is making steps, small steps, but making steps to resolve the issue in the Donbass. It seems to me the American officialdom wouldn't be very happy with that. They don't want to see peace. As a matter of fact, they like to see this tension because they think it is an impediment to Russia, an irritant to Russia. Of course, the people of the Donbass don't simply exist in their minds. They have no agency. Actually, they do have a lot of agency, and over 13,000 people have been killed, most of them in the Donbass. So they know what this is all about here. That dovetails into something that Trump has said ever since the campaign, resolving issues. And I think that Zelensky and Trump see each other as partners in possibly doing that, not this sideshow that we're seeing. Go ahead.
You are right when you said that 13,000 people died in Donbass, but you wouldn't know about it from the hearings. I read the hearings and I see just inaccurate information. George Kent of the State Department says that Ukraine isn't it's not just an abuse of power by the president, but the harm he inflicted on Ukraine, a critical ally under constant assault by Russian forces. More than 13,000 Ukrainians have died on Ukrainian soil defending their territorial integrity against the Russian aggression.
Fiction.
Well, 13,000 people were killed. This is the general number of people killed in eastern Ukraine during the hostilities that started in 2014. A lot of these people are civilians living in Donetsk and Luhansk, killed by the aviation. There was no Russian aviation there. There was only Ukrainian aviation. They were killed by bombs. And Mr. Kent lies to the Congress when he says that they died defending Donetsk from Russian aggression. This is just perjury, in fact. He is providing wrong information.
I have to push back by that.
I mean, it's not a trial. I understand.
But the point is that, and I've said this many times, I mean, and let me address this to Marcus in London. I mean, these hearings, when they talk about American foreign policy, I had the strong impression that they were living in a time capsule. They used the most regular normative Cold War language, and I'm going to agree with Dima here. I mean, they have their lenses see Russia and Ukraine through a Cold War view, and that it's not what reality is all about. They can't escape their ideological obsession here. Go ahead, Marcus.
Look, Peter, I observe hearings in America, and in particular hearings concerning American foreign policy. But do I attach much importance, if any,
I hope not.
to what American politicians have to say, or indeed American civil servants or planners, etc.? No, I don't. I believe in realpolitik, and real politics is brutal politics. The Americans care nothing about 13,000 people having died in the Donbass. It might as well have been 100,000, and they care nothing. Remember, 1 million Vietnamese civilians died because of American aggression. All that matters to American policymakers is ensuring that the Russia of today, which, because of Vladimir Putin, is a superpower again, is limited in its power. And the Americans ideally want to derail Russia's status today in the world as a resurgent great power. And to do that, the Americans understand, as they have since the early 1990s, when the Ukraine became independent, that depriving Russia of a close relationship with Ukraine will severely limit Russian influence and power on the international scene.
Yeah.
Remember, Peter, NATO aircraft operating from Kiev could reach Moscow in 15 to 20 minutes.
Absolutely.
Coastline.
Okay, let me go to Glenn here. One of the things I think interesting that no one's talked about here is Zelensky ran as a peace candidate and an anti-corruption candidate, and everybody knows that. He won overwhelmingly, 72 something percent. The behavior of these bureaucrats is derailing that possibility. They want Ukraine to stay in a state of war or conflict or agitation with Russia. They don't want to see the end of conflict, okay? That's undermining his entire agenda here. 1 minute before we go to the break.
Well, obviously they see something as that this conflict is beneficial in terms, well, for two reasons. One, militarizing Ukraine as this bulwark against Russia and pushing it further out of Europe. And
most of the voters don't see it that way. Most of the voters don't see it that way in Ukraine. We know that.
Yes, but it depends on whose interest whether or not this is really in America's interest, though, because by pushing Russia out of Europe, it's seeking now its new partnerships in Asia. So I think, this is a bit of a strategic divide in the United States as well, what they should focus on. And I think you're right, to some extent this represents something from the past, because Russia is not the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. Its ambitions and ability to dominate Europe, essentially the whole continent, is ludicrous these days. So it is... but they are creating a new alliance, which should be concerned for the United States, and that is putting Russia and China
okay,
right
but
next to each other.
We're going to go to a short break here. But, Ukraine is in talks with China with its road and belt, and this is something the American senators and the political class don't seem to be aware of, and it's very important. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, let's switch gears here. Damon, let me go to you first here. I've been watching Western media coverage of the military coup in Bolivia, but almost nobody says a coup.
Yes.
Okay. It's kind of like another one of these 2014. Yanukovych just went away.
Yes.
Morales just went away. They don't report on the fact that everything that has been done to force him out, and the political events afterwards were against their own constitution, against every single law when it comes to executive authority and actually legislative authority in Bolivia. But everyone in the media is oblivious to it. As a matter of fact, it's bipartisan. It's a good thing. But it doesn't advance democracy there. It's in retreat.
Thank you for making that very good parallel with Ukraine, because when they're talking about Bolivia in Washington, or when they're talking about Ukraine, my impression is that these are blind people. A part of them is aggressive, a part of them is less aggressive, but they all don't understand what they're talking about. Like I read that, in Fair.org, which criticized the coverage of the Ukrainian conflict, they still say that Yanukovych was pro-Russian and against Ukrainian membership in NATO or in the EU. No, Yanukovych was not against it. He was for a compromise. And he had to flee because he feared for his life. He could be killed.
Like Morales.
The same reason with Morales. They keep saying, vote irregularities, then for some reason he had to go to Mexico. And for some reason he didn't take the plane that we offered. Morales said that if I took an American plane, I would most likely land in Guantanamo. His words, which unfortunately may be true,
Okay, let me go to Marcus in London. I mean, the parallels here that we have with Venezuela are really amazing, except for it didn't succeed in Venezuela, but you see the playbook. It is exactly the same playbook. You have these fake NGOs, you have these fake human rights groups, you have election irregularities, which nobody has proven at all. There's been no evidence of it from the Organization of American States. They just said it, okay? And everybody just takes it for granted, okay? And at the same time, the people that are taking control of Bolivia have a deplorable record of racism against the indigenous people. Where are Western liberals defending these people? They're not there, Marcus. Go ahead.
Yes, I read the newspaper coverage in the UK, Peter, of the American-engineered coup, let's be more specific, the CIA-engineered coup against President Morales, and it made my stomach turn because conservative and liberal newspapers painted a completely deceptive picture of events in Bolivia. They portrayed President Morales as almost tyrannical, as someone who falsifies election results. But that is no surprise. Let me tell you this, Peter. In 2007, I was a writer on Tribune, and the editorial line of Tribune at that time was one of jubilation at how Latin America had, largely speaking, elected socialist governments which wanted to regain their political, economic, and cultural independence from America, and who also wanted to forge close relations with Russia. Now, whilst in 2007 I was delighted at the success of socialist parties across Latin America, I was a little bit more pessimistic or realistic because my opinion was that one day the American empire will strike back. America knows, or the US knows Latin America like I know my backhand. The Americans are playing the long game in Latin America. They have penetrated every institution in every country over decades on that continent. And they know this, Peter, that yes, there could be times when anti-American governments come to power, but the Americans have penetrated the establishments of those countries.
You know, Marcus, one thing, interesting thing, I absolutely agree with you, what you've said, and let me turn to Glenn here. Marcus's description is perfect, on the mark, but he never used one word that's important, democracy. Okay, that's what's being denied here. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that tends to be the main division here. Is this a coup d'etat or is it a democratic revolution? You know, which is the new word which, so to some extent, legitimizes coups these days. And I guess you could have a reasonable discussion whether or not the rule of law would allow for Morales to stand for a fourth term. And you can even discuss this issue of whether or not there has been any irregularities with the votes. However, a lot of these arguments kind of become, to some extent, pointless because Morales, he said, okay, well, we can have another election, we can have another election committee, and we can also have it all under international supervision. The UN can come and go through everything.
Or the Organization of American States, which was his mistake.
Yeah, but that was the recommendation by the these are all the recommendation of the Organization of American States. So essentially, he accepted everything. But what happened? Well, you had the military forcing him to go, bullying away all his political allies, and so the military kicking him out. And well, it's and then you have this senator, what is it, Agnes, who then steps in and says, well, I am the new president. And I guess if it is a democratic revolution, where is the rule of law and where is the democracy? Because on his platform, he put everything in place. And not to speak back to Ukraine, but that was to some extent what happened there as well.
Yanukovych made the same deal. Yeah. Early elections. Seema, jump in.
The Organization of American States in Bolivia played the same role as the EU in Ukraine. It pretended to be a mediator, and in fact, it was supporting one of the sides of the conflict. The EU made it possible for the Maidan regime to oust the legally elected president. They just didn't honor their commitments, the EU in Ukraine. The same story here. When did Morales quit? When the commander-in-chief of the army, William Kaiman, made the following statement: "We suggest to the president that he resign his mandate, allowing the pacification of Bolivia." That could come from General Pinochet in 1973. That was the same language. But what is very important, you made a very good comparison with Venezuela. The United States has been accusing Venezuela of appealing for aid to Russia, to China. Okay, President Morales in Bolivia did not ask for aid from Russia and China. His economic record is very good. Even his opponents
ask the indigenous people.
Exceed that small and medium enterprises flourished. Bolivia was the poorest country in Latin America. He raised a lot of people out of poverty. So you cannot make the same accusations against him as we make against Maduro. But Maduro asked for help, and Morales didn't. And what happened to him? Yeah. So the same story as with Colonel Gaddafi in Libya. He
did everything he was supposed to.
Did everything the West asked him to do. He disarmed. And what happened to him? Morales did not ask Russia and China for help. And what happened to him? So next time when the United States and the Organization of American States or the EU, when they ask someone else, stop asking Russia and China and others, stop asking them for aid, that person will think twice before following that advice.
Marcus, let me go back to you in London. Dima is absolutely right. I mean, poverty, extreme poverty was tackled with great success under Morales. I really do worry because, first of all, you have the military. It's always dodgy when the military is calling shots. And then you have this political opposition that is intensely racist. There are even fascistic backgrounds of some of these characters, very well documented. Please go to the gray zone, for example. I really worry about the people of Bolivia, particularly the people that are most vulnerable. They've moved ahead over the last decade. Are they going to fight to keep it, or are we going to see some kind of dirty war? That's probably the worst case scenario. Go ahead, Marcus in London.
Well, Peter, you know as well as I do about the right-wing death squads that America trained, armed, and supported in other means in Latin America during the 1980s, all in order to keep socialism out of Latin America and to keep Soviet influence out of Latin America. And I would argue that is the case today. The Americans, Peter, what really turns my stomach is how British and American commentators talk about how in Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia, there are human rights abuses. Well, excuse me, one of the key successes of socialism in Latin America, as was the case with Soviet communism, has been education, health, and welfare. That is a human right. Many of the health systems, for example, the health system in Cuba, actually leaves the health systems in the Western world standing. But of course, American and British commentators do not care about the welfare of ordinary people in Latin America, as they don't care about the ordinary welfare of people in the Ukraine. What they care about is ensuring that no other country can have influence in their backyard, which is how they regard Latin America as, and they do not want socialist governments coming to power. Because socialist
but it's interesting here, Marcus, if I can go to Glenn here. I mean, if you do have these, you have instability, intentional instability in Venezuela. We have it now with Bolivia. What you could see is migration north. I mean, and this is a domestic issue in the United States here. You can't have it both ways, okay? You can't say you want to call the shots in Latin America and not experience the consequences thereof. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's, well, again, similarities in Europe. You can't topple all these governments in Northern Africa and Middle East unless you're going to have a migrant crisis, and the same applies in the United States. Now, obviously, I guess Venezuela on that point will be more of a concern than Bolivia. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to add as well that the presentation of the media of this, though, is, I find it quite staggering.
It's Orwellian.
Because when these protesters are protested Morales' government, they are peaceful protesters, they're pro-democracy. But as soon as he's toppled in a coup and those loyal to him begin to protest this unconstitutional removal of power, they become violent mobs. And again,
we turn on a dime.
Then this is largely what happened in Ukraine as well, if you remember. Because once Yanukovych rejected or the association agreement with the EU, you had all this protest, and they were hailed by the EU and Americans, giving them cookies, and they were, pro-democracy, democratic revolution, and taking over government buildings. As soon as they had toppled Yanukovych,
burning them sometimes, burning them, not just taking them.
But when they had taken power, and you saw the same happening in Easing, we actually don't recognize the legitimacy of this post-coup government. They were, villains, mobs. They didn't have any agency. They were just the tools of Kremlin. And in this kind of legitimized,
we're going to wrap it up here. But the interesting thing here is that, again, we've all stressed here, directly and indirectly, how mainstream corporate media plays its role in these power plays here. That's all the time we have, gentlemen. Many thanks to my guests here in Moscow and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.